HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Politics of Pain, Postwar England and the Rise of Nationalism, by Fintan O'Toole. Read by Bruce Mann. The fact is that in spite of the way we behave, we cannot any longer feel that the infliction of pain is merely funny. George Orwell, 1944. Preface. The importance of not being earnest. In her classic study, Watching the English, published in 2004 and updated a decade later, the social anthropologist Kate Fox wrote of her compatriots that the kind of hand-on-heart, gushing earnestness and pompous Bible-thumping solemnity favoured by almost all American politicians would never win a single vote in this country. The English, she claimed, watched such American demagogues on the TV news with a kind of smugly detached amusement, wondering how the cheering crowds can possibly be so credulous as to fall for this sort of nonsense, such shamefully earnest platitudes in such ludicrously solemn tones. Fox proposed that all public discourse in England must observe what she called the importance of not being earnest rule. Yet, just 2 years after the revised version of Watching the English appeared, English political life came to be dominated by shamefully earnest platitudes about national destiny, uttered in ludicrously solemn tones. After June 2016, when the English heartlands of the United Kingdom voted to leave the European Union, all that smugly detached amusement seemed fatally misplaced. The English had thought of themselves as peculiarly immune to the delusions of cheering, credulous crowds. Other people, especially Americans, might be suckers for sententious appeals to an imagined national exceptionalism, but the English were protected by a force field of ironic self-deprecation. Their sense of humour was not just a form of amusement, it was also a way to keep political passions in proportion, to cut dangerously grandiose ideas down to size. One might therefore conclude that the great crisis of English identity that came to the surface in 2016 is, essentially, a sense of humour failure. The dikes of detached amusement that had kept all forms of political extremism at bay had somehow been breached, and in rushed a wave of gushing earnestness about England's special place in the world. This was certainly the case. A solemn appeal to a unique national destiny was now shaping political life. But things were much stranger than that, for the importance of not being earnest rule was not really broken. Even as the country set its face towards one of the most radical disruptions in its modern history, it could not bring itself to do so earnestly. Things were desperate, but not serious. Not serious enough, at least, for this great departure to be properly planned, responsibly negotiated, or efficiently implemented. If, as is often said, comedy is tragedy plus time, Fox observed in her study that the time required for the English to turn tragedy into humour is about a nanosecond. And, one might add, vice versa. A delightfully anarchic sense of humour, as I suggest in this book, is one of the sources of the political anarchy that took hold in England after 2016. Karl Marx claimed that everything in history happens twice, the first time as tragedy, the second as farce. But in this great national crisis, the two states were simultaneous rather than sequential. There was barely a nanosecond between them. And to understand how this could be, we have to enter into a collective frame of mind in which self-deprecation and self-aggrandizement are not opposites. They are conjoined twins. Fox wrote of the wonderfully wacky opening ceremony for the 2012 Olympics in London that the degree of self-mockery, self-denigration, obscure self-reference and self-indulgent eccentricity exhibited in that ceremony required a breathtaking disregard for the opinion of others, in this case billions of others, which can only stem from a deep sense of superiority. In the years after she wrote those words, they became a perfect description of another set of games hosted in England. The strange spectacle of Brexit would show the world how a country previously admired for its apparent equanimity could so paradoxically denigrate and mock itself in pursuit of an elusive sense of superiority. The near implosion of British politics after 2016 was obviously a local variant of a wider crisis of democracy. As Donald Trump Jr. wrote in March 2019, "In a way, you could say that Brexit and my father's election are one and the same. The same rhetoric of the people versus the elites was deployed using the same dark arts of mass persuasion. It is equally obvious that the stunning result of the Brexit referendum was merely the most dramatic expression of a much wider sense of alienation in Europe. The long years of budgetary austerity after the great banking crisis of 2008, gross inequalities in the division of the spoils of economic globalization, and the huge wave of refugees from the catastrophic collapse of Syria created a potent cocktail of popular anxieties. Across most of Europe, the reactionary right has both fed and been fed by those anxieties. The old coalitions of Social Democrats and Christian Democrats struggled almost everywhere to maintain their footing on a centre ground that was rapidly narrowing. White identity politics filled the vacuum where the promise of incremental progress had once been. It makes perfect sense, then, to see what happened in England as a local version of a global phenomenon, just one eruption on a great seismic fault line that stretches across the continents. But it is also different. For one thing, the English continued to vote, both before the Brexit referendum in the general election of 2015 and after it in the election of 2017, for their traditional political parties. In England, 88% of voters cast their ballots in 2017 for either the Conservatives or Labour, and this long-established duopoly won all but 9 of the 533 English parliamentary seats. More strangely, those who led what was in effect a peaceful revolution in 2016 could not actually take power. The insurgent United Kingdom Independence Party, UKIP, which under its former leader Nigel Farage created the demand for the referendum, actually lost virtually all of its vote in 2017. The leading Brexiteers in the ruling Conservative Party, most notably Boris Johnson, were unable to assume control of government, leaving it instead to the lacklustre Theresa May, who had played no significant role in the referendum. There is something both very odd and highly distinctive about this. A revolution at once triumphant and timid, boldly self-assertive in principle, but in practice tentative and hesitant to the point, ultimately, of complete paralysis. This peculiar continuity amidst the upheavals is, in one sense, easily explained. Antipathy to Europe displaced the anti-establishment anger that England shared with the US and other countries away from the indigenous establishment and onto Brussels. This might even be seen as, in one sense, a brilliantly self-protective act by a ruling class that anticipated the coming wave of rage, but channeled it away from its own shores. This, however, begs a key question. Why did this deflection work? How was it possible to convince a majority of voters that they needed to be liberated, not from their actual rulers, but from an imagined prison house of European regulation. To put it mildly, the Brexiteers, when placed under the pressure of making their dream project a reality, did not emerge as political geniuses. They were effective, surely, not because they had a superb plan, but because Brexit was a drilling down into the half-buried layers of a very distinctive English mindset. It hit pay dirt, and out gushed a flow of feelings highly specific to the mental terrain of post-war England. The most potent of them is a feeling that it was just not right for England to be a normal European country, that there is something amiss with an arrangement in which it appears to be just one prosperous, privileged Western European democracy among all the others. As the Chief Secretary to the Treasury and ardent Brexiteer Liz Truss tweeted in April 2019, "We are not an ordinary country, we're an extraordinary country." The X in Brexit also stands for exceptional, and what is exceptional about Britain is that it won the Second World War, but almost immediately lost an empire. It is to the strange consequences of these closely related aspects of its modern history that we must turn for an explanation both of Brexit's imaginative appeal and of its inability to function as a real political project. Its power and its impotence have the same roots in the history and culture of post-war England. The great upheaval after 2016 was never really about Europe. Those who caused it turned out to have very little interest in, and consequently very little knowledge of, the EU itself. They did not understand how the EU would negotiate as a collective, or how seriously it would take its own rules, or how it would prioritize political necessities over economic discomforts. They had no plan for how the UK would relate to the EU after Brexit, largely because that relationship was not the real focus of their obsessions. They were concerned, in reality, with Britain's relationship to itself and to its own self-image. Their desire was to exit a condition of ordinariness which, they had succeeded in convincing themselves, is an unnatural and oppressive imposition on an extraordinary country. This sense of oppression is imaginary, and it is the imaginative world from which it arose that is the subject of this book. But I also suggest that the indulgence of this masochistic pleasure created a demented variety of wish fulfillment. Its perverse magic was to make real the very conditions that were conjured as dark fantasies. The bedrock assumption was that England was humiliated by being in the EU, and it actually humiliated itself on the world stage through its inability to organize a coherent departure from the EU. It was driven by a profound sense of self-pity. It produced a genuinely pitiable image of a British polity in a state of near collapse. It evoked the EU as a bureaucratic monster, but itself became a nightmare of bureaucratic tedium, in which politics came to be dominated by obscure technicalities. It wallowed in the notion that England had become a colony of the EU, but then led the country towards the real possibility that it would end up as a mere satellite of the EU, not part of its decision-making process, but unable to escape its orbit. The route to such irrational outcomes cannot be entirely rational. It must run through a strange and dark terrain that, on the mental maps of a very particular reactionary discourse, is called England. Introduction. London that summer had a sort of heat I'd never experienced in Ireland, the dense, closed-in kind you only get in very big cities. It was 1969. I was 11 years old, and this was my first day in England. I'd come over on the boat from Dublin to Liverpool with my father and my brother, who was 13. We'd come on the bus through the English Midlands, a deeply foreign landscape of motorways and service stations and giant power plants. My father's first cousin Vincent had met us at the terminus, and we'd taken another bus across to the East End, where we'd be staying with my mother's sister, Bridget. Bridget was a nun, so we were actually going to be staying in a Catholic convent. Between the heat and the prospect of 3 days behind convent walls, my dad decided he could do with a pint. So my brother and myself were left sitting on a low wall with bottles of Fanta, while Vincent and my father disappeared into the pub. I remember sitting on that wall and sucking on the straw to try to suppress a rising panic. We were alone in England, abandoned in an alien place. England, as an idea, terrified me. I knew from history lessons in school that the English only ever did bad things to Irish people. And I knew that the heart of that badness was Protestant. There was only one true faith, which was, of course, Catholic, so England by its very nature was deviant. You wouldn't know what to expect of such people, except that it would not be nice. My older brother was playing it cool. I was sweating with heat and inherited anxiety. Then, along the road, came an enormous man in flowing white robes, his height accentuated by a tall leopard-skin hat. He had an entourage of 5 or 6 men, also dressed in white, but far less flamboyant. He was surely some kind of dignitary, a minor king perhaps, or a tribal chief. I couldn't help staring at him. He held my gaze, and his face lit up with a huge smile. He patted me on the head in a gesture of blessing and benevolence, and said something to his sidekicks in a language I did not recognize. He looked down at me and asked, "Are you enjoying your pop?" Pop wasn't a word we used in Ireland for sugary drinks, but I knew what it meant. I knew from the British comics we devoured, the Beano and the Dandy, that it was something English kids said. And it struck me that he thought my brother and myself were natives, that we were English. I was quite indignant. I wanted to explain to him that he had it all wrong, that we were visitors, at least as foreign as himself. But I was too awestruck to say anything, and, in any case, he was sailing majestically onwards down the street, trailed by the brilliant white wake of his entourage. I've sometimes wondered what my 11-year-old self might have said to that regal personage if I could have articulated any of my feelings. What if he had heard my protests and dismissed them? Well, you look English to me, so why all the fuss? What if he'd asked what we were doing here anyway? I'd have had to tell him that my Uncle Vincent, who was in the pub behind us, had left working-class Dublin and been able to get a great education in England, ending up at Oxford University and then as a lecturer in English at Warwick, and that we were going to stay with my auntie, the nun, who was working as a nurse in the East End. And after that, we'd be going to stay in Maidstone with my father's brother Kevin, who had been a quartermaster sergeant in the Royal Engineers and voted Tory. And then we were going to stay with my mother's brother Peter and his wife Cilla in Manchester. He was a bus driver, and she worked in a sewing factory, and they were Labour people. And that all their kids, the cousins who spoke with a Kentish burr or a Manchester drawl, were the same as me, really. That we played the same games and watched the same TV programs and listened to the same pop songs and got on together immediately we met because we were family. I'm not sure he'd have been convinced my Irishness was anything more than a tiny local variation of Englishness. It was much more, of course, and it still is. Being Irish isn't something you have to prove, it's just a matter of fact. But it's also not simple, and in particular it is not what my 11-year-old self thought it was, the opposite of being English. Relationships within what we now call these islands are fluid, ambiguous, and complex. England, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, and the Republic of Ireland form some kind of matrix, but it is always shifting and never stable. And the people who belong within these entities are not simple or stable either. We let entities go, and we bring them back from the dead. Sometimes the network of relationships matters a lot, and sometimes we forget about it because we are too busy looking inwards. Most of the time, we are quite comfortable holding at least two contradictory ideas in our heads at the same time. I grew up with those contradictions. The official Irish culture of my childhood and youth was one that defined Ireland as whatever England was not. England was Protestant, so Catholicism had to be the essence of Irish identity. England was industrial, so Ireland had to make a virtue of its underdeveloped and deindustrialized economy. England was urban, so Ireland had to create an image of itself that was exclusively rustic. The English were scientific rationalists, so we Irish had to be the mystical dreamers of dreams. They were Anglo-Saxons, we were Celts. They had a monarchy, so we had to have a republic. They developed a welfare state, so we relied on the tender mercies of charity. In other words, I know exactly what an either-or identity looks and feels like. But life just wasn't like that. 2 of my uncles and 2 of my aunts fought for the British during the war, and I have always been proud that they played their part in defeating fascism. My aunts and uncles were very happy to work in factories and services in English cities. They emigrated, not so much to England as to the welfare state. The Irish, like so many other migrant peoples, helped to build one of the great achievements of civilization, the National Health Service, and enjoyed its benefits. They relished the educational opportunities opened up by British social democracy. And, though they were certainly capable of racism, many also relished life in a multi-ethnic society. Many of my cousins are half Irish and half Afro-Caribbean, or half Irish and half Asian. And, though Catholicism was an important point of distinction, it is also true that many Irish people preferred to live in England because they could escape from Irish sexual prejudice and repression. 6 years after that first visit to London, when I was 17, I spent the summer working in a huge cinema in Piccadilly Circus. It was the first place I was ever asked a particular question: "Are you gay or straight?" I murmured almost apologetically that I was straight. Apologetically, because I had quickly realized that almost everyone who worked there was gay. The manager was gay, and he hired gay men, so that the place was a kind of safe haven. I had been given a job on a mistaken assumption. But that was okay. I was tolerated. And it was an important, if rather ironic, experience, a tiny taste of what it's like to belong to a sexual minority. I think in different ways England did this for a lot of Irish people. It taught us how majority and minority are movable feasts. In Ireland, most of us were part of a powerful majority culture. In England, we had to learn what it was like to belong to the few rather than the many. So we had these 2 very different ways of thinking about England, as the opposite of us, and as a place where us could mean something much more fluid and open. And the poignant thing about the decade before the Brexit referendum of June 2016 is not that one of these ways of thinking had banished the other, it's that they've both been banished. The first one, the notion that Ireland and England are opposites, is long gone. No Irish kid today would experience the sense of strangeness in moving through a built-up English landscape that I felt in 1969. Most Irish people now live in the same kind of urban or suburban places as their English counterparts do. Ireland is a lot less Catholic, and England a lot less Protestant. And in any case, religion matters much less to either nation's collective identity. Perhaps most importantly, England and Ireland are no longer the two opposite poles of nationality on these islands. Wales, and in particular an unsettled Scotland, are much more assertive parts of the matrix. So, the historical antagonisms I grew up with had been replaced by intense cooperation and a mutual interest in peace. It is no exaggeration to say that Anglo-Irish relations were, in the years immediately before the Brexit vote, more cordial than they had ever been in the entire tangled history of these islands. The loss of this simplistic opposition is all to the good. It vanished in part because Ireland has changed. The time is long gone, for example, when Irish people had to cross the sea to experience life in a multicultural and multi-ethnic society. Rapid inward migration since the 1990s has brought that experience home. The time is also gone when LGBT people felt they had to leave Ireland for a more accepting culture in Britain. After a referendum in 2018 overturned Ireland's ban on abortion, Irish women no longer have to travel to England to terminate pregnancies. If England is less of an escape for Irish people, it is partly because there is less to escape from. But things are changing for less benign reasons, too. The image of an open, tolerant England, a place of opportunity and acceptance, is not gone, but, after June 2016, it has been diminishing rapidly. It is harder to know what to make of England, because it is harder to guess what England makes of itself. It sometimes seems that there must be a fixed amount of anxiety about nationhood and identity in these islands. When it falls on one side of the Irish Sea, as it has done in Ireland, it rises equally on the other side. If the oppositions we used to live with are gone, we are left with a paradox. The Irish Sea has never seemed so narrow, or its two sides so alike. Yet Ireland and Britain may be about to become more separate than they have ever been, divided by a European Union border. There was a time when many Irish people would have dreamed of this state of affairs, when fervent nationalists would have loved nothing better than to have the strongest possible barriers between Ireland and Britain. As the Irish nationalist ballad had it, "The sea, oh the sea, long may it roll between England and me. Thank God we're surrounded by water." But now it is hard to find an Irish person who would not deeply regret it. That, in itself, says something. Underneath the politics, things have settled down into an ordinary decency, a largely contented neighbourliness. After so many centuries of bitterness, that is no mean feat. The delight of Anglo-Irish relations in the decades after the Belfast Agreement was that they had finally evolved to be nicely boring. The sharing of a small space in a big world had become as normal as it should be. To each other, the English and the Irish were no big deal. But the fact of it all being no big deal was a very big deal indeed. Just because it was undramatic, we should not have let this state of affairs be taken for granted. It is hard won, and it should not be lost sight of in all the madness of Brexit. I write this by way of introduction because this book...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?